Welcome to Dev Bootcamp Live, the podcast where we help you level up so you land your first engineering job and you become the best engineer on your team. My name is Juan Lizarazo.
And I'm Jared Potter.
Okay, Jared. So today, what are we going to talk about?
Yeah, the topic today is going to be talking about the distinction between a static web page or web app and a full-blown single-page application web app. So we're just going to kind of explore, what these two things are to make it really clear for students that I've noticed have had some trouble understanding the difference, and also when to use one over the other. There's not one clear answer to say, hey, always use a single-page application or always use a static page. So let's go ahead and jump into it.
Yeah.
So Juan, why don't you give a kind of a high level view first of a static page versus a
Yeah,
spa?
let's provide some context. So, back in the day when web app development started, or static websites, right? Everything was more simple. We used to just create websites with HTML, and the styles were attributes in the HTML. Then CSS came on the picture, and then we started like decoupling and separating these concerns for styling and presentation and markup, or the structure of the document. But then as the internet started evolving and we had more needs for faster things, for more dynamic applications, then we started transitioning how we build front end, right? And that's when the boom with these frameworks started, and more heavily heavily based applications, JavaScript based applications started taking over, and especially because also machines started becoming faster, phones became faster, right? So now it was easier to just have a lot of JavaScript. Back in the day, JavaScript was slower. You had to be very careful with the things you could do. It wasn't cross-browser compatible. It wasn't as standardized as it is today. There was no transpilers, right? But the problem with that, and it's something that I've noticed as a trend, is that now we just default to like, let's do Angular everything, let's do React everything, let's do Vue everything. But always we want to think about the actual need, right? So providing the context of the difference. So that context I provided of how we used to build things before, that's more the static websites, right? Or static web applications. Why there are also web applications, even if they're static? Because they still have JavaScript. They still can be powered and interactive by JavaScript. They can still fetch some information, right? But the difference is that the markup, or we have these applications built, is what's called markup driven. So we have the HTML written or the files, and they don't really change. They're just as is, right? Like a page that does not change anything. Maybe, let's say, and that doesn't mean it's not dynamic. For example, you can have a page with a static JavaScript that just changes the date and says today's whatever date, right? That's still a static website because you are not changing the source code based on other information. You're not fetching data from external servers. And one of the keys to differentiate is we want to think about are you fetching things from a database? Is state driven, and that's when we talk about dynamic web applications or single page applications, right? Which is when we have this dynamic state that we just have the application and it reacts to that state and it renders based on that state. So that's like the differentiation between those two. Like we have a source code that never changes, and if I need to make an update, I have to update the source code. And then we have this source code that we deploy. Do we need to make an update? We change some database, some APIs, and then the application doesn't really need to change. So that's kind of like, for example, Facebook, right? That's very dynamic. It's a web application. But if we have a website, like for example, my portfolio page or my welcome page or your welcome page, right? It's just a static markup, and that's really, so that's kind of like the high level difference, providing some context, Jared.
Yeah, you did a great job providing the context around there between the static site and a single page application there. Yeah. So yeah, let's go ahead and I want to get into talking a little bit more about some of the specific pros and cons. First, looking at kind of the static site. So Juan kind of already introduced it there, where if what you need to build, right, either for yourself or maybe for a client that you're getting started with, a local business, whatever, a lot of companies, or local businesses might just simply need a static site. They just need to communicate information to users, right? So they can be searched on the internet through Google and be found and provide some information like what's their store hours, what's their menu, what kind of services do they provide. But beyond that, there's really limited interactivity, but that's okay because that's all they really need. So in that type of case, Juan, would we build just kind of like some standard HTML, CSS, and maybe a little bit of JavaScript, or would we like build it with React?
I would say when you like when the nature of your applications is that, hey, I need to deploy this and I don't need to update it until next year. Like that is telling you that a static application is you're gonna get to market faster, you're gonna deploy it faster, and it's gonna be rendering faster. Another benefits, because we'll have to talk about this too, is that it's gonna index easier in it's going to have search optimization, right? Search engine optimization out of the box also with certain aspects, because it's going to be parsed by the search browsers, by Google, by Bing, right? So that's kind of like the default that I would go with that, because I would be like, yeah, I can build you that, and it can take, a week, 2 weeks, like it depends, right? But if we start adding layers to something like that, like, hey, this doesn't need to change for a whole year, and then we build like, okay, let's build an API, a React app, let's add the database, our deployment is more complex, and we can still get to market, but you're adding layers that you don't need. And it's kind of like you're over engineering these, because that's not why, like, for example, React was born, right? React was born because Facebook had a lot of dynamic things, right? And PHP just on its own and the pure JavaScript, it was getting out of control. So they were like, hey, components, this seems to be a good way to tackle this problem, right? And they did it, and they did it really well. And then other frameworks and libraries starting following, right? And now everything we build today is with components, but because they're highly dynamic. So that would be like my take. Like if you're building something that does not change often, right? Even if, let's say, you want some dynamic thing, for example, hey, I want to show the weather widget every day. That can still be a static markup driven application, because you can just put a little bit of JavaScript that just like shows the weather thing, and that's it, right? You don't need to have all these extra layers that over engineer the application. And that would be my take on that case for that. And this is
Yeah.
by the way, this is a very controversial topic, right? Because there's like people that are like, no, everything is React, or everything has to be dynamic, or everything has to be Angular, right? But I think we have to use the tool for the right thing, and the tool has to serve us and not the other way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's still definitely a place in the world for static sites, static web apps. Again, because I mean, a lot of the reasons that Juan just said, it's a lot simpler. You're not adding on the level of complexity. It's going to be better for search engine optimization, because it's going to be easier for the search engines to parse your page. And generally, it can lead to your site being a little bit lighter weight, or faster, because you're not ending up including any sort of extra JavaScript libraries or any of the overhead that might come along with that. A couple of the other kind of little benefits that I've seen as well is that it does offer a lot of flexibility. And when you do want to maybe add a little JavaScript library for a very specific purpose on your website, it's pretty easy to take vanilla HTML, CSS, JavaScript and just add in a little library, and you get to control what gets brought in.
You just copy the script tag from the CDN and add it, and you're done. It's going to load fast, right? It's a CDN, distributed network, highly available, and you're done. So that's very important. Another thing with that is that it's not that it's a bad thing to do dynamic applications. The problem is, like, let's say you create a dynamic portfolio and you want the portfolios to be indexed by Google. Then you're going to have another layer. You will have to do server-side rendering. And yes, you can have those optimizations, but then adding another layer and server-side rendering is very hard when you have these single-page applications, right? Because they have these different states that then have to, let's say, talk to each other and sync, right? And then it makes it difficult. It makes it difficult. And there's tools that make it easier, but there's a lot of layers and a learning curve. Another thing is that, and we can talk about this, Jared, is that when you mentioned that part about the performance, right? That the lighter weight loads faster. The reason is because there's not so much scripting time, right? So for our audience out there, you have homework with us. Research about the pixel pipeline. The pixel pipeline is like the steps that takes to render pixels in the browser from the moment you visit and make a request to a web server. So there's a scripting time because when you have a React application, it has to download React, right? It has to download the bundles. It has to download the libraries, and it depends on how the application is built. But in general, in Italy, at least the minimum things to render that homepage or that first application if everything is client side from the browser. So that has a performance cost, and there's a scripting time there. So that when you have just markup driven applications, it's just gonna load and render right away because there's no extra scripting time. Maybe if you have some JavaScript, it's gonna run after everything loads. If you need it that way, or if you can render it after the document is ready, for example, right? Or if you don't need that, you can just start scripting before, but it's gonna be, that's why generally those are more efficient. And that's why they just naturally load faster. Jared, what do you know about like, or what do you think about like, because there's other alternative. This take where we can create a React app or a Angular app, and then we can create a static site of them. So there's different tools about that, and that's like an extra step, but that's also we can talk about those tools too. Like what tools have you heard about on those? If you're familiar with those, I haven't used a couple, but I haven't, like, not professionally. So I'm sort of familiar with a couple of those, but not really like an expert, because usually I just default to like static markup if that's the case at that point.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a few popular tools out there, and I mean, we're not going to get too deep into static generation, but there's kind of these two things that you can kind of do. Let's say you do have an app that's either written in Angular or Vue or React or something like that. You can kind of do two different things. Either one, you can do a static site generation, where it basically will take your markup and actually render it out to be an index.html file. And then you could then host that particular file. To go a level beyond that, you could also add on something called server-side rendering, which will then, every time there's a new request is made, it will then actually render it on the server. Kind of a funny thing is that server-side rendering has actually been around for basically forever. If you think about PHP, if you think about ASP, all of those things are ultimately rendering on the server and then providing an index.html file on the front end. But to get to the specific tools, in the world of React, there's a thing called next.js. And then in the world of Vue, there's something called Nuxt, N-U-X-T JS. And both of them provide both static generation if you just need to do it once, or if you need to actually have server-side rendering as well. One last bit as well is, like, you can still do that and still then ultimately have React or Vue running as well. But it just helps that initial load be faster and helps with search engine optimization. But Juan, is there a tool for Angular? I'm not sure if there is actually one out there. I assume there is.
Yeah, so here in Utah, we have, there is this engineer that is very involved with the Angular community, Aaron Frost, and he and his team with his company, they worked on Scully. So they launched it, I think, last year, and I think it's still like beta or alpha or release candidate, but I'm not sure. I haven't checked for like 6 months. But Scully is a site generator, something like Gapty, right? Like for React, that you create your Angular app, you use Scully, and Scully will generate like static pages based of your routes and your views. And if your routes use dynamic things like APIs, then it will generate the static markup for it, which is great for indexing and static site generation. But yeah, everything comes to trade-offs, right? So if you have to create, like for example, my students, they ask me like, hey, I want to create a portfolio page. I tell them like, they know React, but I tell them, well, you know React, but really you don't need to do React, and it's gonna be faster to not use React because it's an overkill for just a basic portfolio page or a contact page, right? But if you need to build something rich, let's say I want to build, I don't know, a news feed, pulling news from an RSS feed, that is still could be static. Use a static markup, a little bit of JavaScript that fetches that, and it's done, really. You don't need to add all these frameworks and tooling, because remember, when you pull in a framework, let's say you pull in, or a library, let's say you pull in React, you don't need just React, you need Webpack. And Webpack doesn't just use Webpack. They have their inner dependencies, right? Their internal dependencies. So you're pulling 200 or 2000 modules, right? When you check your non-modules, and just to do all this build process. And this is funny, Jared, when you were mentioning about the, like, ultimately, like, back the server-side rendering has been around for a long time. It's really funny because we started doing like static applications, doing client, right? Everything was client HTML. Then there were needs, right? So we started doing a lot of server. So we started a lot of PHP and Ruby on Rails and a lot of backend stuff. And now it's like we're back to like, okay, let's do just know client. Client is better, SPA, everything, Angular JS, React, right? All these things. And then everything became again client, but then it had the trade-offs. It was lower, all the not indexing, friendly indexing with the search engines. And now we're back to like, okay, let's go back to the server, but let's mix it, right? So it's kind of like this back and forth, but just think that everything has trade-offs. And I think we should give some examples, Jared, on when it should be better to do just a static or do dynamic, even though we know like we can get away by doing just static or just dynamic and still we can get it to work, right? It's just that one is going to be harder, right? Let's say we have a dynamic side, very dynamic. We could do static and a lot of heavy JavaScript, but maybe we're taking the longer path, right? So it's just trade-off. So give some examples, yeah. Like for example, a basic contact page for a company or a basic homepage with products and a contact page that change every year. Static or dynamic web app? What would be better there?
Static.
Static, definitely. I couldn't hear you. I think you're rolling.
Static.
Yeah, now I hear you. Yeah, I think you went down for a moment. Okay, perfect. So other example, let's say Facebook. We're building facebook.com. Do we use static or do we use dynamic? Like do we use React or Angular or something like that?
Because it's so dynamic, it's gonna be a dynamic web app.
And why is it dynamic? Like let's provide that context, but after our break, let's share our Twitters and then let's provide the context why Facebook, for example, why it's so dynamic. Like what do we mean by that? Let's dig into that, Jared. Let me share here our Twitters. So you can always reach out and follow us on Twitter. So my Twitter, right, is just JUANLIZARAZOG. That's my handle. And you can find links on whatever platform you're listening this on or watching this on. If you're on YouTube, subscribe. We publish content every week. If you're in any other platform, follow us there so you get the new podcast. This is an audio format, so that's why we don't share anything on the screen or live code for you.
And everybody can find me at twitter.com/Jared Potter. That's JARED POTTER. Feel free to send me an message, right? Be happy to answer your questions or even just say hello.
Yeah, you can tweet at us and we're always like engaging and interacting, right? Like there's some funny things happen sometimes too. Like Twitter is interesting. I like that platform a lot. But yeah, just follow us, follow Jared, follow me, subscribe to this platform. We're creating good content and new content every week. So continuing, Jared, like when we say dynamic, like really what's happening? Why is it so dynamic? Like, let's talk about that.
So something like Facebook or any other social media, the idea is, people are posting new content all the time. People are commenting, people are liking posts, sharing posts, right? Things are very dynamic, right? They're changing a lot. And for this reason, you could go out and do something like static site generation on top of Facebook. But really, because the content's changing so much, like the benefits you're getting from generating your site or statically hosting your site, like the search engine optimizations, those kind of end up being diminished because the content is so dynamic. So really, yeah, the kind of the solution here is when the content is changing so frequently and it is just a variety of different content that's coming in, that's an example of when you would want to very specifically use, a single page application without any sort of static generation or SSR.
And and that's perfect. And there's another alternative in between because we have like, hey, client only or just a static, right? But we also have this server only. For example, let's say we use Laravel in PHP or Ruby on Rails or ASP.NET, stuff like that. We have those benefits where we use server side, we dynamically generate the markup and renders from the server like if it was a static. So it indexes. And that's another way to build things that I think we take them for granted. Like today we default like, no, it has to be an API because my application is going to scale to millions of users, right? But I always tell like, just cross that bridge when you get there. Like if you create you have a great idea for an app, just build it, like take the fastest path to take it to market. If the app goes viral or if the app grows, it starts making money, then at that point, start improving your infrastructure. But don't spend because this is a common mistake we make. I have made that mistake, right? That we get all excited about tech and we start like adding layers and things, but we learn those lessons the hard way. And that's why we're sharing those lessons now. So, so we have that take too. Like if you need, so usually I think like we have, for example, Jared, we have a project and I say like, okay, we need to build this project. The first question is how often you need to update the data, right? Is it like daily, weekly, right? If it is something daily or weekly, maybe a CMS, server-side rendering, would do it, right? But is there like a lot of customization and a CMS does not work, like something like Joomla or any content management system, then it's kind of like, okay, maybe then we need to do the API, React or Angular or one of those stacks, right? Or no, it changes once a year or once every 6 months. Then just a static. You can build it in 2 hours, right? So yeah, that's like
Yeah,
good
definitely.
examples.
Yeah, so now, I mean, we kind of have covered static sites pretty well. So I kind of want to transition to talk a little bit about some of the merits of using a single page application. What are some of the biggest benefits? So to kind of get into that, I'm going to talk about one of the limitations of static sites, which is that, when you're using a static site, when you go to your index.html file, you load it in your browser. And if you then want to go to a different page, like the contact page or just any other page, you'll notice, and if you watch carefully in your browser, the whole page will change. It'll refresh. And you'll also notice in your little tab in the top, it's going to do a little spinny thing. That means that your browser had to make a whole request to the server and it then had to come back before it could even display it. And this is totally fine on lots of different types of websites. But if you want an even like faster, snappier user experience, that's where using a single page application is really useful. And when we talk about single page applications, it's what we've been talking about. You're generally using a framework, React, Vue, Angular, or any of the other 2 dozen frameworks out there, libraries that you can use for this purpose. So one of the core benefits is that, if you go to facebook.com or twitter.com, and if you try to clicking in between the navigation between the different pages, you'll notice that it changes pretty much instantaneously. And you'll also notice that the whole page does not refresh. You do not see that little spinner. So this is one of the benefits of using a single page application, is it kind of just provides a more immersive experience. But yeah, Juan, can you tell us a little bit like what is the browser doing in a single page application than a static?
So the trade-off there, of course, is that let's say you have a header, a navbar, right? And then the content page, and you're in a static page, and then you visit the contact and you go to About Us. What happens is that the browser is gonna make the request to the server, say, hey, I wanna visit this route. The server says, yes, I have this file, serves that file, but you are re-downloading again the markup for the navbar, for the sidebar, for the footer. So you are having more chattiness, right, with the static side because you're downloading these things, and it's fine. But if you have a lot of dynamic content that you need, it's just gonna be better to have that single page application experience. And how it works is that you just have, traditionally, it depends how you build it or architect it, but traditionally the basic ballpark is that you just have a file, an HTML file, like an app.html or index.html, and that file is loaded just once, downloaded. That file downloads some JavaScript, and that JavaScript bootstraps the application. So that's when the application starts, once JavaScript works. If you turn off JavaScript in your browser, like if you say your browser block JavaScript on all the websites, I guarantee you, you're probably not gonna be able to use like 80% of the websites out there or web applications, because all of them require JavaScript to have a good experience. Maybe big companies like Twitter and Facebook have a fallback where they just work with pure HTML, right, for those type, but maybe it's not widely supported, meaning that it does not support all the features. So the benefit is like you downloaded the index, but now you don't have to really download markup anymore. Or maybe if you do, you just download what we call partials, which, let's say I visit another page that has a little weather widget. It will just download maybe some JavaScript that will append that HTML dynamically, or maybe downloads that HTML and then appends it dynamically, but it's a partial, it's not re-downloaded everything. So just because of that, is faster because it's just requesting what is needed. And the most common case, for example, you visit your Facebook newsfeed. And Facebook is a good example because everybody knows about Facebook, so it makes it easy, right? The thing is that, let's say you visit a newsfeed with Facebook and you scroll down, it's just downloading data and it's state driven. So downloads new data and says like, hey, new data, this is what I need to render. But everything to render that page is already in your client. So the request and the chattiness is very reduced because it's just downloading the new bytes for that text, for that post, right? For those URLs, for the image that your friend posted, like those different things. So that's why like the experience is faster. And that's why like for these software as a service companies is traditionally better to go with a dynamic application, right? And it can be either just full server side or something like React, Angular, like maybe a MERN stack or these different stacks that we have, right? But that's kind of like how it works, and that's why it feels faster. There's no navigation. The routes are virtual routing. All the routes always redirect at the server side to your index.html because the routes are not found, so redirects to that. And that's one of the problems, though. Like, we don't really have a true not found code when you don't have routes because everything is handled from that main entry point file. So it's the trade-off, and that's why indexing from the search engines do not work really well, because they just see one single file with that snapshot of what they have, maybe without JavaScript or with some JavaScript now, but you don't have all those routes because it's kind of like there's no sites there. They are
Yeah,
virtual.
no, I think it's worth talking a little bit about that, of why, people talk about single page applications not having as good of search engine optimization. So to kind of give you a little bit of sense, it's that, when a search engine is going over all these different websites, they're going to load the index.html file. But, if a lot of, a naive solution is the search engine is just going to assume that as soon as it loads that index.html, that's it. It's going to scan that page. Now, if it's a single page application, like Juan said, you're going to be downloading a little bit of JavaScript. You're going to then be running that JavaScript. The search engine that's indexing might not stick around, right? For all that content to be loaded to then index it. Similarly, you want to ensure that when you are building your navigation, sure, you could build it in a way where like you could create like buttons, but really you do want to continue to use anchor tags in your single page applications, because more smarter search engines will actually recognize that, hey, you have a header, a nav bar, and it's going to be able to then go in there and potentially explore those other sites from your main page there. Again, certain search engines are aware of single page applications running and will account for that.
But it's
But it's
not
always something to
great.
think about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like from my experience, like I have just gotten like the homepage with some of the dynamic data, but that's it. Nothing else. Even if I create a sitemap, does not work. And that's when static generators are good for indexing, but it's another layer to maintain. So it's like everything is trade-offs. So Jared, let's just give, to wrap it up today, let's give some takeaways. Instead of a recap, let's do takeaways of things to like keep in mind, right, for our audience. So for example, takeaways like one, if you're building something that does not change often, the data once a year, once a month, right? Go with a static. It's just easier, right? It's easier and you'll build it faster. That will be my first takeaway. Second, don't over-engineer. Don't add layers you don't need, even if they are cool and trendy. Don't create more work for you, okay? Third takeaway, Jared.
Yeah, well, I think you took the two good ones there, but just to add on a little bit there, but yeah, just being really careful about asking yourself, what do you really need when you're building something? Again, just because it's trendy and fun, like React, Vue, or Angular, or whoever, whatever other stack of technology that you want to deal with, sometimes that's not what you need. And honestly, making sure that you are still building static sites with basic HTML, CSS, and maybe a little bit of JavaScript, those are foundations that you're still going to be using in any other framework or anywhere else. So, be able to embrace when you do need to just build a simpler site, a portfolio site, local business site, what have you. But at the same time, I would also add just the takeaway of, it is important to also keep practicing the, frameworks, Vue, Angular, React, because those oftentimes, advancing those skills is going to help you ultimately help land you a job.
And for takeaway, if the site changes often, use a dynamic and framework, right? That would like the conclusion from what you just mentioned. So yeah, everything is trade-offs. I would say like if you're using, let's say you're using React, go play with one of the 100 static generators for React and just like, install the package, generate the static code base of that, play with it so you have that sense of what it takes to create the static sites of your React app. And then think like just play with that tool. And if you're using Angular, play with Scully. If you're using React, you have more options. If you're using Vue, use, what was the name of the Vue one?
Next.js.
Use that one. So just go and play. It's something that you need to do at least once. And then when you really need it, like, hey, well, we could use these for that, right? And you know about the tooling out there. And of course, I mean, this is just high level. We're just throwing concepts at you. You have to go and do your homework, research about it. It's just like for us to put these things on your radar so you know, like, hey, this is a thing. It's okay to do pure HTML, you know, like these basic things. But yeah, no, that was it. So this was awesome. So yeah, I don't know, anything else to add before we wrap it up, Jared?
Nope, I think that's good.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much for joining us in this episode of Dev Bootcamp Live, where we help you land your first engineering job and we help you become the best engineer on your team. I'm Juan Lizarazo.
And this is Jared Potter.
And thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
Take care.